Hello and welcome back. This is going to be a little bit of a geeky technical video, so probably not for everyone, and that's why I decided to split this out separate from the main review that I did on the new Ardbeg Heavy Vapours, which is a wonderful whiskey at an excessive price. I think that's a fair judgment if you haven't seen my proper review of it. But Ardbeg Heavy Vapours has got everyone talking about something that is quite overlooked when it comes to stills and still design and distillation of whiskey, and that's purifiers. So this is going to be a little video about purifiers, what they are and what they do. And I always think you can't talk about purifiers without talking about reflux. So what is a purifier? What does it do? Why is it important? And what even is reflux? Let's find out. It is a relatively rare thing in the world of whiskey distillation to use a purifier. We've got, I think, well over 120 active distilleries in Scotland at this point in 2023, and I believe we've got 10 of them who are actively using purifiers at some point in the process, with some of the most famous being Ardbeg on Islay. If you've done the tour there, you might have seen the purifier that they use. Glengrun also use purifiers, Edredour and Talisker. Around half of the purifiers that are in use on Scottish distilleries are water-cooled, which basically makes them more effective, and half of them aren't. Purifiers tend to either be on the spirit still or the wash still. More rarely you can see some distilleries that use them on both the wash and spirit stills, including Glengrun and Tormore. Ardbeg, the distillery that everyone's talking about the purifier at the moment, they have the purifier on the spirit still only, and it's a non-water cooled purifier. So what is the point of a purifier? It's all about controlling reflux, more specifically increasing the amount of reflux that you get in a controllable way. So next obvious question, what is reflux? Well, if you imagine that a whiskey still, whether it's the wash still or the spirit still, that still's job is to cause alcohol to evaporate out of the wash, rise to the top of the still, go around the bit at the top, which is what we call the line arm, and run down into the receiver. Reflux is essentially when alcohol vapours that have evaporated cool down and condense when they're still inside the still, and return into a liquid state and run down back into the bottom of the still, rather than exiting through the line arm. So you can kind of think of reflux as being an additional check on anything that's evaporating out of the still. Anything that initially evaporates but it's made of heavier compounds, that's going to be more likely to condense than the lighter compounds, and it stands a greater chance of being recycled back into a liquid state. So there are a bunch of things that can affect reflux, what compounds are condensed and go back into the reflux cycle, and at what stage they might experience reflux. Things that can affect type of reflux and rate of reflux are things like still shape. If you have very narrow stills, that causes more reflux because it's harder to escape without condensing on cold copper. You have to remember that the copper, because it's exposed to the air outside the still, and hopefully the still house is not as hot as the air inside the still, the copper is going to have a cooling effect on any vapours that touch the inside of the still. The height of the still also affects reflux. If you have very, very tall stills, that gives you more reflux because there's just further for all of those heavy compounds to go. Again, similar to still shape, if you have very narrow stills, having a very tall still just makes it less likely for each molecule to escape without condensing. Ambient temperature in the still house also has an effect on reflux. If you have a cold still, that still is going to condense the spirit more quickly. And it's also important to mention that if you have a very tall still, you have to remember that the heat source is at the bottom of the still. So if you have an incredibly tall still, that copper at the top of the still is not getting the heat. It's not going to be as hot as the copper lower down. So if you have a very tall still, you're going to have relatively cool copper at the top of the still, which is going to give you more reflux. So that's two reasons why a tall still will give you more reflux. Another thing that you might have seen if you visited a lot of distilleries is what they call a boil bulb. So a boil bulb is the spherical part of a still that sits between the actual body of the still and the neck at the top. So some stills have an intentional bulge in the middle, which just acts as a little bit of a buffer, a little bit of an obstruction to those vapours that just makes it that little bit more likely that that spirit will touch the copper and condense. While we're talking about obstructions, it's probably worth mentioning Lohmann stills. A Lohmann still is kind of a cross between a pot still and a continuous still, in that a Lohmann still has adjustable plates inside the body of the still which can be turned to either increase or decrease the amount of reflux. And that's a really handy thing, because that means that you can have the same stills in one distillery, and you can use those same stills to make entirely different styles of whiskey depending on what you want on that day. Another fancy little trick is that some stills are actually water cooled themselves. So with some stills you have the ability to pump cooling water around a water jacket on the still, and obviously by cooling the copper inside the still, you're increasing the rate of condensation and increasing the amount of reflux you get. Something that some people might overlook is the actual angle of the line arm itself. So like I said, the line arm is the roughly horizontal part that comes out of the top of the still. So you might think that once those vapours have got to the top of the still and they exit by the line arm, that's it. They've done their job, they've escaped the still, they're on their way to becoming new make spirit. But if you look at a lot of whiskey stills, more often than not, the line arm tends not to be horizontal. And you have to remember that the line arm itself is made of copper, the same as the still. And that copper is in ambient temperature, so there's the same chance of the vapours touching that copper and condensing as there are in the still. So if you have a line arm which is angled up away from the still, as any vapours condense in the line arm, if the line arm is angled up away from the still, they'll actually condense and run back into the still. Whereas on the other hand, if you have a still where the line arm is angled down away from the still, that means that anything that condenses after the start of the line arm is going to run directly into the receiver. So generally speaking, a line arm that points upwards is going to give you more reflux and a lighter spirit, which is very similar and also related to a purifier. Remember that? Purifiers? That's what we were talking about at the start. So a purifier is a pipe coming off the line arm that feeds back into the still. So obviously the pipe coming off the line arm comes off the bottom of the line arm. So anything that condenses in the line arm, whether it's pointing up or down, will run through the pipe from the purifier and end up back in the still. Sometimes that purifier, the pipe coming off the line arm, will just be a straight pipe that comes off the line arm. Sometimes there'll be a vessel, either small or large, coming off the line arm that pipe feeds out of. Sometimes they'll even be water cooled to make them even more effective. And obviously the larger the chamber is on the purifier, if it has one, that also gives it a larger area to shed heat, so it makes that vessel cooler, which will also give you more reflux. So what does all of this mean, and what does it do? What does it actually mean for our finished whiskey? Well, essentially, the more reflux that you get, you should get a lighter and fruitier and more estery final spirit. Generally speaking, having a large degree of reflux also means that you get a slightly higher ABV off the stills, which, truth be told, is probably a large part of the decision to put purifiers on stills in the first place. The less reflux that you have, you get a heavier spirit with more body, more oiliness and more heavy compounds coming off the still. So there you have it. That's basically reflux and purifiers, everything that you never wanted to know. And I think it's probably fair to say that reflux in general is a very complicated thing, and it's a bit of a black art, and even a lot of master distillers probably don't pretend to fully understand what it does and all the complicated ways that it affects the individual flavours in the finished product, but it's very important and very interesting. I also think that it used to be talked about a lot more than it currently is. I think there used to be a lot of talk, and by talk I probably mean marketing, mainly on boxes for fancy whiskies. Used to be a lot of marketing and talk about still size and still shape, and how every distillery claimed that they had the best still shape and it was unique, and because of their unique stills they produced a whiskey that had a flavour that couldn't be replicated by anyone else. And it seems to me like a lot of that has kind of been forgotten about once the cask finishing craze started and it all became about wood because cask finishes not only allow you to mess around with the flavour, but also to a greater extent allow you to polish turds. I still think though, that geometry and reflux, along with fermentation and grain selection, forget your cask finishes, they are the true flavour science of whisky, because it affects the flavours of the spirit itself, and it's a really interesting subject. I think so anyway. Let me know what you think. Cheers.